explaining to me, this event and our brothers and sisters coming home. And I remember the emotion, and I felt a revisiting of that yesterday, watching the footage, and as well the mourning, for a hero. And then realizing that our non Zamora, in a way, does not need the Aliyat Neshama of our learning, because he is in the ultimate Aliyat Neshama, in that he gave his life defending the Jewish people. And his wife asks that we remember him not only as the very brave soldier that he was, who fought on October 7th at Yad Mordechai and returned again and again to battle in these most dangerous of places, but that she remembers him as the most incredibly loving husband and loving father, and that's the memory we should carry. So for perhaps the zchuyot of our learning, because he is elevated beyond any zchuyot we could generate, should just be for the return of all of the rest of the chatufim to the land and people waiting for them, and that we are now approaching our third regal. It was Sukkot and Pesach and now Shavuot of this war and captivity, and it should be the final one. And just we should merit speedily to hear continued Besurot Tovot. It's a particular joy to have the opportunity to learn together with you in these last hours before sunset, when the 3 days of Hagbalah, these 3 holy days of preparation for Shavuot, begin, and to engage together in the learning of Megillat Ruth. I always say, if one is allowed to have a favorite book in Tanakh, my favorite would be this lovely lyric, pastoral book of Ruth, 83 psukim, which are really just one narrative of human kindness, of seeing Ruth's incredible dedication to her mother-in-law, to her deceased husband, to her nation, to Boaz, to God, to the future of the Jewish people, to the extent that in Ruth Rabbah, Rav Zera comments, Amar Rav Zera, in the Midrash on Ruth, Megillah zu ein ba lo tum'ah velo tahara, lo isur velo heter, v'lama nichteva. Why was this Megillah written? L'lamedcha kama sachar tov l'gomlei chasadim, to teach us how great is the reward for those who engage in acts of loving kindness. And this idea has sort of crept into even the etymology in the English language of the word ruthless, which means without kindness. So much has Ruth become emblematic of compassion. But today I'd actually like to take another direction. Maybe we'll do that next year. But today I'd like to take another direction in our exploration of Megillat Ruth, and to look at Ruth as the progenitor of monarchy. Because another reason given in the rabbinic literature for the incorporation into the biblical canon of this lovely lyric pastoral work is that it was written, and I quote from the Bechor Shor, Rishon, fairly contemporaneous with Rashi. It was written liyaches et David, to trace the genealogy of David and the Davidic dynasty, King David, who was born and died on Shavuot. And David's lineage was somewhat murky, as he was descendant from a Moabitess, who are, from the laws of the Torah, forbidden to ever graft onto the Jewish people due to the cruelty that they demonstrated when we were leaving Egypt and seeking water and bread. So David's lineage was in question, and that this book was written to trace his genealogy. So this book is a highly monarchic work, a work which at its core is a work of leadership, monarchy, governance, law, and it's through that lens that I'd like to explore Megillat Ruth today. And even though I so prefer looking at all of you to sharing a PowerPoint, you'll forgive my basic PowerPoint skills. I did put together a Google Slides that we will use throughout today, and intermittently I'll stop just to be able to see all of you simultaneously again. So give me just a moment to share screen. Okay, here we are. Okay. Okay, and Hindi, Adina, actually, you are the first I see on my screen. So can you give me a thumbs up, you and Sharon, just if you could see the screen? Excellent. Yes. Okay, this was my most creative endeavor so far at a PowerPoint. Where you go, I shall follow. Ruth and the legacy of the Davidic dynasty. And the way that I came to this approach that we are going to be taking today, this study of monarchy in the book of Ruth in a comparative sense, actually came to me many years ago when I had the pleasure of teaching on a gap year program to beginner students who were spending a semester or year abroad. And this was really their first exposure to Jewish study and Jewish texts. And what they lacked in background knowledge, they more than compensated for with this fresh, creative approach to texts that they were really encountering for the first time as young adults. So I was teaching them a survey course on the 5 Megillot, and the course began at the beginning of the year with Kohelet in advance of Sukkot, and then we continued with Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs, so that the two works attributed to King Solomon were studied back to back. We then studied the book of Esther until Purim, and the book of Ruth until Shavuot, and we concluded the year with core themes in the book of Echa, Lamentations, exile and redemption, and rupture and return. And the juxtaposition of these two works of Ruth and Esther led to some lively conversation among the students as to the highly comparative nature of these two works. So they pointed out that these were only the two biblical works, the only two biblical works that are named for women, and with women as their epicentral characters. We also discussed how Ruth is the story of a princess, according to the Midrash, who willingly chooses the impoverished life of a commoner, whereas Esther is the story of a commoner who is reluctantly catapulted to royalty. And we spent some extensive time discussing how both of these works, at their core, the heroine or hero struggles with issues of foreignness and identity. That Esther spends the bulk of the narrative in the book of Esther in the palace, forced to hide her identity. Ein Esther magedet et ama et moladeta. And in the book of Ruth, we see that Ruth, despite her valiant efforts to shed her identity as a member of the licentious nation of Moab and join the Jewish people, is still referred to throughout the text often as Ruth HaMoaviyah, Ruth the Moabitess, and she internalizes the sense of otherness when she introduces herself to Boaz with the words Va'anochi nochriah. So both of these works also grapple with issues of foreignness and identity. Each of these works, Ruth and Esther, Esther and Ruth, have this climactic scene in which the main character, the protagonist, Esther or Ruth, is forced to sort of transgress the norms of modesty for the greater good of the Jewish people. And in Esther, this takes place when she goes unbidden at Mordechai's behest. She goes unbidden to King Achashverosh to ultimately request the salvation of the Jewish people. And according to the halachic literature, there is a view that Esther was actually married to Mordechai, not only his niece, but his wife. And as long as she was in the palace of the king under forced circumstances, she was considered an anusa, like a woman who is forced into a sexual encounter, and thus not forbidden to Mordechai after. But that when she went for the first time on her own to King Achashverosh, perhaps she relinquished this status and gave up her sort of her family life, as it were, in order to save the Jewish people in this act of like seeming brazenness. And there's a similar climactic scene in the book of Ruth. When Ruth goes down, Ruth, who we just mentioned, tried so hard to shed her identity as a member of this licentious nation of Moab. When she goes down in the middle of the night, under darkness, the cover of darkness and suspect circumstances, to awaken Boaz, and at her mother-in-law's request, Vatigal Margalotav, and to sort of uncover his feet in order to awaken him. And each of these climactic scenes are initiated by another and preceded by detailed, extensive preparation in the text. Right? In the book of Esther, this climactic scene is initiated by Mordechai and preceded by 3 days of fasting and of prayer. And in the book of Ruth, this scene is initiated by Naomi, and also you'll notice on Shavuot with detailed, extensive pre-preparation in the text. Very detailed instructions. There are also some strong literary similarities between these two works. They are both novella, sort of short stories, more concerned with character and plot rather than overt moral messaging. And they also each serve as a companion text, neatly fitting like a short story, fitting chronologically into a larger biblical work, with Esther folding neatly into the book of Ezra, and Ruth identified as sort of a subchapter of the book of Shoftim. And finally, and this will lead into the next segment of our learning, each of these works chronologically serve as bookends. The literary term is inclusio for monarchy, with Ruth as the genesis of the monarchic dynasty of David, and Esther as a story that takes place in the monarchy at its period of great decline. And both of our protagonists, Esther and Ruth, are also identified within these works with a monarchic figure, right? Esther is traced to the house of Kish Ishimini and the house of Shaul, and Ruth, obviously, at the end of the work as the ancestress of King David, right? So we have these two works that are highly similar. And what I'd like to do with our time today is use a literary technique that I often use when I speak at the Jewish Center, intertextuality, to do a comparative study of these two works. And I'll take a moment just to spend more time than I usually have, about 2 or 3 minutes, just to define intertextuality and its use in the rabbinic literature. Intertextuality, the term is a contemporary one. It is when we take two works that have something pulling them together, something in common, and we study them in comparison with each other to gain a deeper meaning of each individual work and a deeper meaning of the relationship between the two works. And while Chazal did not use the term intertextuality, we certainly see it extensively demonstrated in multiple models throughout the rabbinic literature. I'm so glad that my first attempt to make a PowerPoint that has things appearing in stages is working. One of the ways that Chazal use intertextuality is to draw things that are disparate chronologically and push them to look at the scenarios in a comparative way. So an example of that would be a statement like Yiftach b'doro kishmuel b'doro. Jephthah in his generation as Samuel in his generation, pushing us to look at similarities and contrasts between these generations and between the two leadership styles of Yiftach and Shmuel and the outcomes. Another example of a rabbinic use of intertextuality would be similar phrases that appear at different points in the biblical canon, similar or identical phrases, one of which relates to one of our Megillot that we're looking at in this study. An example would be when Yaakov, I don't like to use the word stole, but co-opted the Bechorah, the birthright from Esav. When Esav learned, the text describes his reaction as Vayizak za'aka gedola umara. He called out with a great and bitter cry. And the rabbis comment in the Midrash there, Vehechan nefralo, and where was Jacob punished? B'Shushan habira, where after the decree against the Jewish people is ordained, said Mordechai goes out in the streets of Shushan, Vayitzak tza'aka gedola umara, and calls out a great and bitter cry, right? Causing us to see like a midah keneged midah of sorts. This could be a whole shiur of its own, but a midah keneged midah, or connection between these two instances in the relationship of Esav and Yaakov. Another example of the rabbinic use of intertextuality would be rare words, right? The Latin term hapax legomenon. When a word appears only once or twice, if it appears twice in the biblical canon or 3 or 4 times, there's definitely correlation to explore between the narratives or the individuals. An example of this is the word vayivez, meaning and he despised, which only appears twice in the biblical canon. It appears once talking about Esav, vayivez et habechorah, right, when he despised the birthright after he sold it. And it appears again in Megillat Esther regarding Mordechai, that vayivez, it was like despicable in his eyes that Mordechai, it was despicable in Haman's eyes that he could not punish or react to Mordechai. So again, forcing us to look at these two biblical stories in tandem, or pushing us or encouraging us to look at these two stories in tandem with each other. My favorite sort of intertextuality is what the A contemporary biblical scholar, Robert Alter, refers to as a type story or a narrative that recurs throughout the biblical canon. So an example of this would be a hero born to a barren woman, or an epiphany in a field, or the idea of meeting one's betrothed at a well, right? The Midrash in Shemot Rabbah tells us when Moshe meets Tzipporah at the well, that Moshe followed in the ways of his ancestors, right? There were three who met their betrothed at a well, Isaac, Jacob, and Moses. Again, pushing us to look at these stories, how a well relates to the idea of love, how these figures relate to each other through an intertextual reading. And what I'd like to sort of posit and focus on today is that Esther and Ruth, these two books that are highlighted with many of the similarities that we noted, are actually both books that are very much speaking to a common theme, right? They're both highly monarchic works. They deal a lot with governance, legislation, and law. And in that modern iteration for us in our lives, that would be leadership. That is a core theme in both of these works. And what I will do is I will stop sharing for one moment. So I get the pleasure of looking at all of you for a few moments before we return to my slideshow, which I hope is working okay for you, and speak for a few moments as to how each of these works are highly monarchic in nature. So we'll begin with with the book of Esther chronologically and how we read them, so we can culminate with Ruth. The book of Esther is obviously a highly monarchic work. It takes place in the palace, and the themes of legislation, the word dat is a milah mancha in Hebrew, a Leitwort in German, a word that appears again and again more than any other book in Tanakh. The word dat, which today we translate as religion, but in the biblical canon, the word dat means law. So it begins with this, right, this monarchic scene in the setting of a palace, the legislation about the wine at the party, the legislation for Vashti to arrive, the legislation of her punishment when she does not, the legislation of all women needing to speak the language of their husbands sent out to all the lands, the legislation of this macabre beauty parade that results in Esther's selection as queen. And there's this climactic legislative scene when Ahasuerus gives his signet ring to Haman, a legislative scene that almost leads to the complete devastation and destruction of the Jewish people and is only narrowly averted through God's salvation. So we have this like monarchic setting and these themes of law and governance, leadership, monarchy dominating throughout the book of Esther. And they are used consistently for the narcissistic benefits of the leader, of Ahasuerus, and to the detriment of the vulnerable in society. So we have leadership abused, as it were, or leadership gone wrong in the book of Esther, used to benefit the ruler and to the detriment of the vulnerable in society. And the vulnerable here, this is something my students pointed out to me that I hadn't noticed. The vulnerable here is Esther, who is doubly vulnerable from a halachic status. She's vulnerable in her personal status as an orphan, right? Where there is special compassion that we grant to an orphan for their vulnerability and in halachic status. She's vulnerable also in her national status as a member of a despised people in the empire in which she lives. So we have this book of Esther, monarchic, legislative, leadership-oriented work, which gives a description of leadership gone wrong. And we're going to contrast this to the book of Ruth, right? The book of Ruth is also a highly monarchic work. It's how we titled our class today, The Legacy of David. It is the book that traces the genealogy of the monarchy that lasted throughout the large part of the Judean Empire, and the monarchy that we pray will be returned in the Messianic era, right? So there's an eternity to the monarchic nature of the Davidic dynasty. We have laws that appear throughout this work also of leket and shechacha and pe'ah, of how we treat poor people in the fields. But all of these laws are laws that are altruistic in nature and meant to elevate the vulnerable in society, right? So we have legislation that's used consistently for elevating the vulnerable. We also, in the book of Ruth, have this climactic legislative scene. And this is the one that takes place at the gates of Bethlehem in the final chapter, And it is the one that results in Ruth's being welcomed into the Jewish people and ultimately becoming who the Midrash refers to as Ima Shel Malchut, the matriarch of royalty. There's this beautiful lyric Midrash that when King Solomon built the temple, he set aside a chair. And when asked, who is that chair for? He said, it is for my great-grandmother Ruth, Ima Shel Malchut. And my students also pointed out to me that Ruth is also doubly vulnerable. She's vulnerable in her personal status as a widow, and she's vulnerable in her national status as well as a member of a despised people. So when we look at leadership in the book of Ruth that we're about to read, we see leadership used consistently for altruistic purposes and to elevate the most vulnerable in society. Right? So two narratives speaking to a common theme, but Esther representing not Esther herself, but the book of Esther telling a story of leadership gone wrong, narcissistic leadership, as it were, and the book of Ruth telling a story of leadership, governance, law, legislation, right? The iterations of leadership gone right. So what I will do now is we'll return to our slideshow for a moment. Okay. Right now, let's see, Panina, you're at the top right now. If you can give a thumbs up if you see the slide, it's shared. Okay. So we have these common themes that we just discussed, speaking to this idea of leadership. And if we opened up discussing the similarities between the books of Ruth and Esther, Esther and Ruth, and pushing us to look at them in an intertextual way, what I'd like to highlight for the next few minutes are what I see as three core differences between these works that have lessons to each of us in the leadership roles that we all play in our own lives, in our personal settings, in our communal settings, of how to be sort of the difference between leadership gone wrong and leadership gone right. So we opened up comparatively looking at these works. And in order to discern or identify and tease out what leadership gone right looks like, we're going to highlight three differences between these works and try to extrapolate lessons for our own lives from them. Okay. Sorry, a little bit about the extension. It took me some time to figure out how to take a text and a photo and place it into a slideshow, but what you're looking at is actually a beautiful 1617 illustration, a scroll of Esther that we call an illuminated manuscript with pictures throughout. The author is anonymous, though we do not, or rather the illustrator is anonymous. We attribute the authorship to Esther. The illustrator is anonymous, but the text is accurately dated to 1617. And I thought it would be a beautiful picture to look at as we consider the setting and elements in Megillat Esther as we're about to contrast to the book of Ruth, right? So the setting of Megillat Esther is one of immense luxury, right? It would be the deep purples and golds of monarchy would be the colors. And when we think about the descriptions, and it is a very descriptive text, right, these descriptions of incredible opulence and luxury. The core food element in the book of Esther that flows throughout, literally, is also a luxury food element. It is the element of wine. The language in the book of Esther, we'll think about this when we look at Megillat Ruth, which is a small 4-parak work of 80 psukim. We have 10 psukim of excessive verbiage, where whenever more than one word, a word could be repeated, it is v'chelim mechelim shonim, kasher avadati avadati. So if we look at the book of Esther, it is a book that uses the language of hubris, of luxury, but of hubris and of excess. Right? And so I selected this text kind of in this, monarchic scene of luxury to sort of highlight that a dominant sort of setting and element motif, the dominant setting and element motif in the book of Esther is that of luxury, of excess, of hubris, right? Of ego. We're going to contrast this to these three actually late 1800s postcards that are in the collection of the National Library of Israel. The first one was done by someone named Lajos Brut, who is a Hungarian artist, lived from 1846 to 1910. The first one is his illustration of Ruth. They were all published by this company, Chevron, which was like an old company in Eretz Israel back when it was a small Jewish settlement in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And the last two are postcards which were designed by a French artist, Henri Frédéric Chopin, 1804 to 1888. He actually won the Prix de Rome, a significant prize for his drawings and paintings. And I thought I would use these to illustrate, they're not overtly Christological, but to illustrate sort of the setting and elements of Megillat Ruth. Right? If you look at any of the paintings from the medieval worlds and the modern worlds of the Book of Ruth, they're all set in this very pastoral, outdoor setting of fields. And indeed, literarily, I counted, and the word sadeh, field, appears 16 times within the 80 psukim or 83 psukim of the Book of Ruth. So the setting is very much a setting of simplicity. Unlike the indoor luxurious palace of the Book of Esther, the Book of Ruth takes place almost completely outdoors as people move from Sedeh Moab to Sedot Beit Lechem. The only sort of indoor scene that even the court scene takes place at the gates of a city. And the only indoor scene we have is actually on the threshing floor at the night with Boaz. And a threshing floor is a liminal space between indoor and outdoor. So we have a setting of outdoor and of simplicity. If we look at the core food element in the Book of Ruth, contrasted to the Book of Esther, where the core food element is one of luxury, the core food element in the Book of Ruth, I'm going to be quiet a moment so you could think about this before I share it. Right? The core food element is grain and bread. Right? It appears Boaz gives Ruth six grains of barley, 6 kernels of barley. Ruth collects sheaves of wheat. We have Bet Lechem referred to again and again. So the food element here is also a food element of simplicity. And something that I ask you to pay attention to in terms of literary elements, setting and physical and literary elements in the Book of Ruth, when we hear it read in just a few days, is the simplicity of language. Right? The book is written in almost a Spartan prose. There isn't repetition, and the language is almost the polar opposite, literarily, of the Book of Esther. So contrast number one, setting and elements. And I think the lesson we draw from this between leadership gone wrong, which is rooted in hubris and excess, and leadership gone right, which is rooted in simplicity and humility, is that leadership gone right is servant leadership, and leadership that comes from a place of humility and a desire to serve, as a place of, instead of a place of narcissism and a desire for power. So that leadership gone right, lesson number one from our contrast, is leadership that is rooted in humility, right? From our intertextual contrast of these two works. I broke one of the cardinal rules of making slides here, only to give you a visual of one particular part. I do not expect you to read through this text. But I did this to symbolically show you a very fascinating additional literary distinction between the books of Esther and Ruth, a very stark literary contrast that I think gives us a second message after the message of humility as how we create leadership gone right rather than leadership gone wrong. And this has to do with the very different nature of dialogue in the book of Esther and the book of Ruth. The book of Esther has almost no direct dialogue. One of my favorite words is obfuscated, like when things are deliberately complicated with excessive verbiage. People rarely, there's a tremendous lot of passive language. Let it be sent, let it be written, let him be summoned, let her be brought. There's a tremendous lot of passive language, and people rarely speak to each other. They posture in front of each other, right? Vayomer mehuman lifnei hamelech v'hasarim. They send messengers to each other, but they rarely talk to each other. And even the lines of conversation that there are usually groups of people speaking and not two people, what we call in Hebrew, sichat arba einayim, right? Just two people communicating cleanly, clearly, simply to each other. So the reason that I put up this chapter is I chose to visually show you the second chapter of the book of Esther, and in a moment, the second chapter of the book of Ruth, so that you can see this contrast. Because in the book of Esther, people almost never speak to each other directly. And in the book of Ruth, I did this read through twice, and I would argue that the book of Ruth is actually the most dialogue-driven book in the entire biblical canon, in the entire Tanakh. Over 60 of the 83 psukim are conversation, people speaking directly to each other, looking at each other and speaking clearly. So I thought the second lesson for leadership, gone right after humility versus hubris and excess, right? Humility and simplicity is our first lesson. That the second lesson of leadership gone right is that leadership gone right is rooted in communication, clear, direct, straightforward, honest communication. So to visually demonstrate this to you, this is the second parak of Megillat Esther, and I chose the second parak because it's normal not to expect a lot of dialogue in a first parak where you're sort of setting the scene. So I chose the second parak of Esther and the second parak of Ruth, and I highlighted the conversation, the actual speech that takes place in the second parak. I had to cut it because it didn't fit the slide, but there is still, this is the one highlighted line of direct speech that takes place in the second parak. And it's Hamelech, it's Mishartav. It's still like a sort of plural conversation. This is the direct dialogue, Megillat Esther parak bet. Here I highlighted the direct dialogue in parak bet of Megillat Ruth, because I thought more than anything else, this visually demonstrates the only phrases that aren't dialogue are these kind of connective phrases that, introduce either the individual speaking or what happened between these various parts of dialogue. But I thought, I'm going to go back for a moment, this visually, more than anything else, demonstrates the different nature of communication in the book of Esther, leadership gone wrong, obfuscation, sending of messengers, repetition, versus clear, honest, simple, straight communication as rule number 2 of leadership gone right, based on this intertextual contrast of Esther and Ruth. And the third and final point that I'd like to make, that we're exactly within our time frame, between the leadership gone wrong model of the book of Esther and the leadership gone right model of the book of Ruth, this antecedent and progenitor of the Davidic dynasty and, God willing, the Messianic era, is the very different nature of the absence versus presence of God's name in these two works. It is very commonly known that Esther is the only book in the biblical canon in which God's name is completely absent. We spoke about this before Purim, how in a way it serves as the ultimate transitional work to exile, right? The latest of the biblical works, and living in a world where we do not see God over it. But in the book of Esther, this book of monarchy gone wrong, as it were, leadership gone wrong, God's name does not appear at all. What is less noticed, and I'm going to go through this for you, I highlighted all of the psukim out of these 83 psukim in the book of Ruth, in which God's name appears. And God's name appears 20 times, right? Which is sort of 1 out of every 4 psukim, almost 25% relatively of the psukim have God's name within them. And interestingly, God is not an actor, an active actor in the book of Ruth, right? It's a human-driven narrative, the way Esther is, but God is mentioned constantly by others. When Ami gets up, she says to her daughters-in-law, I've decided to return because I've heard that God has redeemed his people and given them bread. May God deal kindly with you. Kasher asitem and hametim be'imadi. And And Ruth says to her mother-in-law, Elokayach Elokai, right? And when Boaz greets his harvesters, he says, may God be with you. And they answer, may God be with you as well. And he tells Ruth, right, may God reward you for the kindness that you have shown. And Naomi says to her daughter-in-law, after Boaz agrees to marry Ruth, blessed be God who has not left off his kindness to the living and to the dead. And God is mentioned again and again and again throughout the book of Ruth. And even until the end, when the child is born, who ultimately becomes, right, the progenitor of the Davidic dynasty, the woman saying to Naomi, right, blessed be the Lord, who, or, Baruch Hashem, blessed is Hashem, who has not left you this day without a kinsman. Let his name be famous in Israel. So I did this in English so we could go through it quickly, but I wanted to point out the ubiquity of God's name in the book of Ruth, in contrast to its absence in the book of Esther, as our third and final point, as it were, of lessons for what leadership gone right looks like. That leadership gone right is rooted in humility and simplicity, as opposed to hubris and excess. That leadership gone right is rooted in honest communication, as opposed to obfuscation. And that leadership gone right is an awareness of God's presence and God's will, as opposed to the absence. And again, these lessons are given to us in a monarchic setting, but they are equally applicable to the leadership roles that we all play. So I repeat them again. We discussed the setting and elements and the lesson of humility and simplicity from those paintings versus the postcard. We spoke about the nature of dialogue, the obfuscation as opposed to the direct dialogue-driven communication, and the visual example we gave of that. And we spoke about the absence versus the presence of God's name within these two works. And I'd like to close with a very beautiful text from, see if I could see it on my screen and move over. Here we are. Okay. And this is from Rambam, the Laws of Kings, Hilchot Melachim U'Milchama, Perek Bet, and it's the sixth law in these Laws of Kings. And as I reread this text, which I've always found very evocative visually, I actually think that it speaks directly to the three themes that we discussed today. Okay, we're going to be closing with this, but I think that when I underlined the dimensions of this law that I think speak to the ideas of humility, the ideas of communication, and the idea of emulation of God and awareness of God's presence. So I'm just going to read and translate these few lines. L'gabei hamelech b'Yisrael, right? As the laws regarding a king in among the people of Israel. Kederach shechilek lo hakatuv hakavod hagadol, just as the Torah text accords him great honor, v'chayav hakol b'kvodo, and everyone is expected to honor him. Kach tzivahu, so he is too commanded in Deuteronomy. L'hiyot libo b'kirbo shafel v'chalal. Let me try to follow here. That his heart should be within him humble. Shene'emar, that should say, I'm sorry, liviltich uvelibi chalal b'kirbi, and my heart is like a vacuum or empty or humble within me. V'lo yinhag gasut lev b'Yisrael. He should never act with arrogance toward the Jewish people, yoter midai, more than is necessary for holding his leadership. As it is said, levilti rum levavo me'achav. His heart should not be above that of his brethren. V'haya, I love this phrase, chonen u'merachem, he should be merciful and compassionate, laktanim u'legedolim, to small and great alike, even the most humble among the nation, as much as to the great ones. V'yetzei v'yavo, and you should go in and come out, v'chavtsehem u'v'tovatam, thinking of their needs and for their good. V'yachus al kvod katan shabaktanim, and it repeats the smallest child, the neediest person should be in his heart, right? His thoughts shouldn't be of his own rule. Yoram Hazoni points out in his beautiful book, The Dawn, on Megillat Esther, that you look at Achashverosh, he's ruling over all these provinces. And what is he focused on? The details of a party, right? For his own glory. right? The antithesis of this vision of what a king is supposed to be doing and who he's supposed to be looking out for. So all of this idea of the humility dominating in this text of Rambam in this law for kings. Midaber al kol hakahal, b'lashon rabim, when he addresses the entire people, yidaber rakot, he should speak gently. Shene'amar shim'uni achai va'ami, listen, my brothers, my nation, right? And I think this speaks to the nature of communication, right? A king who is speaking directly to the people publicly and in this language of like a gentle language. And Leolam, again, yitnaheg ba'anava yetera, and both his speech and his deed should be with humility. And in the final phrase here, this is actually evocative of the description of how God carries the Jewish people, right? When Moses turns to God and he speaks about carrying the Jewish people, he said, did I birth them that I should carry them as a mother carries her infant? Essentially saying to God, God, it is you who birthed them, right? This idea of an awareness of God's holding the Jewish people and of looking at a godly model of leadership. And the Maimonides continues, V'yispol tircham u'masa'am, the king should carry the weights and burdens of the people, utlunotam, and their complaints, u'ksafam, and their anger. And I say this to myself again, and all of us in any positions of leadership, communal or personal that we hold, right? Our job is to be able to absorb, ka'asher yisah ha'omen et hayonim, just as a mother carries her nursing child, like with love and with compassion. So in this paragraph, which the Rambam holds as halacha l'ma'aseh, that it applies to kings and it will apply to the messianic king as well, to be humble, to communicate with, to look out for the smallest of the people, to communicate gently and with humility, and to act in a loving and godly way. And I close, with this hope that I opened with, right? May this holiday, I was in Israel for Sukkot, I was in Israel for Pesach, right? Both times of war. We're approaching this third of the Regalim. May this holiday bring miracles and salvation to Am Yisrael who need them so desperately. May our wounded of body and spirit be healed. May our hostages be brought back to their families and nation who so yearn for their return. And may Israel be blessed with peace.
Amen.
So we always try to stay. I went a few minutes over. I try to stay within a 35-minute time frame, but truly such an honor and a pleasure to learn with all of you. As when we started, it was before darkness. Now darkness is settling upon us in these Yimei Hagbala before Shavuot. Just wishing everyone a beautiful Chag, and we should be interrupted as we were this past Shabbat with beautiful news relating to all of Israel and the Jewish people. So thank you so much for joining.
Amen.
Thank you. Thank you, Raizi.
Beautiful.
Raizi,
Yeah.
can you go? I want to insert something that it's totally sidebar.
Absolutely.
Can you go back to the illustrations that you started with?
Oh, sure. The painting.
The 3 illustrations. Is it possible to go back?
Absolutely. I will share a screen again, and I am happy to go back to them.
The sidebar comment.
I'm glad you asked, because they took me like 20 minutes each to insert. So I'm glad you enjoyed them and that I can bring them back and you can look at them again. Absolutely. Give me just a moment to share a screen and I will do so. You're talking about the
images, the illustration.
Okay, terrific. You just made me feel like it was all worth it. So even if you didn't mean it, thanks for asking. Okay.
Well, I'm on it.
Gonna
make a change on one of them.
Okay. But here we go. 1 second.
I can reference it if you can't get it up. But
okay, is it this one or the others?
No, the other one.
No, the other one with the 3 images.
Okay, terrific.
That's it. Okay.
You recognize these are not Jewish artists, so
correct.
I'll give that.
You might want to delete the middle one in terms of your theme on the great outdoors. My background is art history, so that's why I'm looking at these particularly. If you notice in the tree in the center, there's a cloth that's hung there.
Mm-hmm.
That
Yeah.
That imagery is from late medieval and into the Renaissance period, and it's called the baldacchino in Italian. And they placed these cloths in outdoor scenes in order to create the image of an indoor scene, even though
Wow.
it's set in the outdoors.
Mhm.
So the artist here is really trying to pull you towards an indoor home, tent, housing environment, which is not exactly the point that you're trying to make when you posit this as an outdoor scene.
Wow.
So I don't
Thank
know if you
you.
want to keep using that one, but the artist
Well,
himself put in the baldacchino to indicate an indoor sense to it.
okay. Well, I made this for you guys, so I'm not sure it's going to be used yet, but I certainly will. I appreciate that wisdom. I looked at it, I glanced at it, thinking a little bit of a talit and a chuppah, and the idea of him taking her ultimately like this protective sense, right? Of bringing her, like she says, ufarast like knafecha al amatecha. You should,
Right.
so that is what I saw, but I'm so
I
glad
think
to
the
learn this.
origin of that image is actually lifted from more Renaissance painting, and that it's really to create a more indoor space in an outdoor scene.
Have you heard of either of these artists? Because I was just looking, I love the National Library resources. So I was looking for Henry Frederick Chopin and Lajos, also known as Ludwig Brut. Had you heard of either of them?
I don't know them personally. I
Okay.
mean, I don't know of them personally, but I'm
Okay.
sure I mean, you can look them
Yeah,
up.
I did. There wasn't much,
There
but I
wasn't much, no.
appreciated being able to show you
Yeah.
the imagery. So
Yeah, no, thank you. They were great. Thank you so much for the talk.
Thanks for joining. Marcy, did you have your hands up? Did you have a
Hi,
question?
yes, I do. I'm here in Los Angeles, and I have heard you many times, and I really appreciate your learned speaking and so on. I have taught women in Tanakh to bat mitzvah age girls for many years, and I suddenly had a thought, and I want to share it with you. And I want to know, the people I've discussed it with, so no, you're wrong. It totally wrong. It's wrong years, wrong everything. I think I see a connection between Hannah and Ruth. Why? Because I feel they're both progenitors of kingship. In Hannah also in a physical way, because she gives birth to Shmuel, who appoints David Hamelech, and Ruth. So they're both a few generations before David. Now I've gone through learning it, and I cannot find. I'm wondering what you think of that idea of putting them in the same kind of category. Or
so I am I am small, but I will tell you that I think it's beautiful to try to pursue that, because it's not only the similarity, it's that, right, Samuel was the one, like, who was he anointed it, like the whole Davidic
Right.
story is also a Samuel story, and there's a strong matriarchal figure in both of those stories, and there's like one is a struggle in lineage and one is a struggle in fertility. Like, I actually think there's a lot to do, and I think never to be afraid of what you don't see.
right.
I think specifically Chazal give us these tools, and the Beit Midrash is meant to be a vibrant place of iteration and renewal of these tools, right? I study a lot
because
from
she says in her tefillah, she says Vayaram Karen Mashiach, meaning to anoint, not Mashiach, but to anoint the king.
Yeah.
And I feel there's a strong connection, and I felt that they both turned Jewish life around, because the period of the Shoftim was so awful. And they
I
both
would say don't listen to the
redemption.
naysayers, Marcy, and I would look forward to hearing, and send me whatever, if you ever want to call and talk about it, I'd love to.
So I would love to hear what to do with all my stuff. I do write, and I'm working on a few things, and I'm also Rabbi Yossi Levine's aunt.
I remember that
So,
when I was in LA.
Okay, good.
Thank
Okay, so
you.
nice to see you. Chag Sameach.
Likewise. Thank you so much,
Okay.
everyone. Thank you for joining. It's such a
Chag
treat to
Sameach.
learn with
Chag
you.
Sameach.
Chag
Chag
Sameach.
Sameach.
Thank you
so
so
much.
much. Thank
was
you so
great.
much.
Thank you. Arthur, glad you made it on the Zoom. I look at Mr. In person at Shuel. So nice to see everybody. Hello, Mrs. Rothman. Nice to see you. I'm just trying to catch anyone I didn't get to say hello to at the beginning.
Raizi,
Yeah?
are you going to teach an Echa, even though it's in the summer?
You know, I have never taught on Eicha, but let me look at it. Let me look. I haven't
That would be
since that gap year all those years ago, but let me revisit it a little bit, Tova.
Okay,
Okay.
thank you.
Good evening.